In 1901, cigarettes became ammunition. Two tobacco empires fought for the right to sit on your counter, using price dumps, locked-in retailers, and courtroom attacks on names and paper wrappers. The first move looked like a simple purchase. Weeks later, shelves flipped, prices collapsed, and no one could tell who fired first. It wasn't a habit anymore. It was territory, and the next move would force an entire industry to pick a side. Hello, I'm William. Let's get into it. Before this war, cigarettes were already changing what tobacco meant. A cigar took time. A pipe took patience. A cigarette was fast, cheap, and easy to sell by the millions. Once you could make them like bullets, you could market them like bullets too. That change came from machines and paper. In the 1880s, the cigarette-making machine made it possible to roll and pack tobacco at a scale no hand roller could match. That didn't just lower the cost. It changed the business model. When your output explodes, the real bottleneck becomes distribution. Not who can roll the cigarette, but who can own the shelf. In North Carolina, James B. Duke saw it early. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He was the man who measured everything and then pushed until the market broke. He tied his company to machine production, locked in supply, and treated every competitor as either a future purchase or a future casualty. At the same time, he built a sales system that looked harmless from the outside. It wasn't. His agents went store to store with contracts, rebates, and promises. If a retailer gave Duke's brands the best space, the retailer got better terms. If a retailer didn't, the supply could dry up, or the price could suddenly look impossible to match. It was pressure disguised as commerce. Then came the trust logic. In the Gilded Age, the cleanest way to win wasn't to outsell 10 rivals forever. It was to absorb them and inherit their brands, factories, and routes. Duke pushed consolidation hard. By the late 1890s, American tobacco wasn't acting like one company among many. It was acting like a central office that could set the weather. And when you build a machine like that, you create a new kind of war. A war where the goal isn't to win a debate, it's to control the channels that decide survival, pricing, retail access, trademarks, packaging, supply, credit. You don't defeat a rival by beating them in public. You defeat them by making their product invisible. But there's a problem with any monopoly machine. Once you dominate your home market, growth slows. The system still hungers because the factories still run, the sales force still needs territory, and the investors still want the next jump. So, the war needed a new front. Across the Atlantic, Britain wasn't just another market. It was a brand-making factory for the world. London set tastes. The empire carried products outward. And British tobacco firms already had deep roots in their own distribution networks, with familiar names and loyal retailers. Men like Sir William Henry Wills and John Player weren't dreaming of an American invasion. They were building their own empires inside Britain's rules, selling to a public that trusted certain labels and knew certain colors on a packet. That's what makes the next step so dangerous. This wasn't going to be a polite export story. It was going to be a collision between two systems that both believed they owned the right to control a market. And in 1901, the first move didn't look like an attack at all. It looked like paperwork. A purchase, a British company changing hands. Then the price cuts started. The retailer pressure followed, and the cigarette war stepped out of the factory and onto every counter in the country. The first move landed in Britain like a quiet insult. A respected British maker changed hands, and overnight, the rumors stopped being rumors. American Tobacco had bought Ogden's, a Liverpool company with real factory capacity and real shelf presence. Not a licensing deal, not a partnership, a beachhead. On paper, it looked like commerce. In the trade, it looked like an invasion. Because Ogden's wasn't just a name. It meant press time, paper supply, warehouse space, and relationships with the people who controlled the counter. British tobacco wasn't sold in abstract markets. It was sold by shopkeepers who decided what sat at eye level, what got pushed when a customer hesitated, and what disappeared behind the drawer. And American Tobacco didn't show up asking politely for space. Within weeks, prices started falling in ways that didn't make sense unless you assumed someone was willing to bleed. Fighting brands appeared, priced so low that an independent maker couldn't match them without selling at a loss. If you were a retailer, it felt like free money. If you were a rival manufacturer, it felt like your product had been turned invisible. Then came the distribution pressure, the kind that never gets called pressure in public. Salesmen didn't just offer a better deal. They offered a deal that came with conditions. Better margins if you stocked the new lines prominently. Better terms if you pushed them first. Better deliveries if you stayed loyal. And if a shop didn't play along, suddenly the best-selling packets arrived late, or the discounts disappeared, or the competitor down the street got a special price that made you look expensive. This is the part the public never sees. A cigarette war is won by inches of counter space, and by which brands a clerk's hand reaches for without thinking. British firms felt it immediately. Not because every customer switched overnight, but because the trade started wobbling. When prices drop fast, the middle layer panics. Wholesalers get cautious. Retailers ask for deeper discounts. Everyone starts calling in favors. A stable business becomes a knife fight over pennies. And the names on the British side weren't small. You had W.D. and H.O. Wills with scale and capital, John Player with a powerful retail identity, and other firms with regional strongholds that had taken decades to build. These weren't fragile family shops. They were Gilded Age-style houses of their own, with factories, brands, and influence. But they had a shared weakness. They were separate. American Tobacco was a machine that could act as one unit. It could sacrifice profits in one area to win control in another. It could flood a city with cheap product, then raise prices once the shelves belonged to it. A single British firm couldn't fight that alone without risking bankruptcy. And if one fell, the others knew the same tactics would be used on them next. So the British answer wasn't a better advertisement. It was consolidation. Behind closed doors, the conversations got blunt. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival. Either Britain built its own combined front, or the American system would pick them off one by one, using their own retailers as the weapon. And there was another layer to the panic: the empire markets. Britain's tobacco firms weren't thinking only about London or Liverpool. They were thinking about overseas routes, colonial networks, and brand power that traveled with shipping lanes. If an American trust proved it could take Britain's home market, it could also punch into the rest of the map. That's when the meetings turned from "what do we do" into "who do we merge with?" Old rivals sat at the same table. Men who had spent years fighting each other over territory and trademarks suddenly realized the bigger predator had arrived. They argued over valuation, board seats, and who would control which brands. But the conclusion kept coming back the same way. If we don't fuse now, we'll be negotiating later with a knife at our throat. So Britain did something that would have sounded impossible just months earlier. The major firms moved to combine into a single shield, Imperial Tobacco. A defensive corporation designed to fight like a trust, because only a trust could fight a trust. And the moment Imperial existed, the cigarette war escalated again. Because now, it wasn't an American company attacking a market. It was two empires staring at each other across the counter, each one trying to prove it could make the other bleed first. Imperial didn't form like a normal company. It formed like a panic room. In late 1901, Britain's biggest tobacco houses did something old money almost never does. They stopped competing with each other in public, sat down in private, and agreed to fuse. 13 firms rolled into one shield, and the first chairman was William Henry Wills, the Bristol tobacco patriarch who already lived with one foot in business and one foot in politics. The message to Duke was blunt. You're not picking us off one by one, but a shield only matters if it can hit back. Imperial's first move wasn't a patriotic speech. It was to unify the thing that decides survival in a cigarette war, the counter. They pushed their own contracts through the retail chain, leaned on wholesalers, and made shopkeepers choose. If you gave prime space to the American-backed packets, you risked losing the British supply that customers already asked for by name. Now the war had symmetry. Two machines doing the same thing with different accents. Duke's side answered the way a trust answers. It didn't try to be loved, it tried to be unavoidable. Prices dropped again in targeted areas. Fighting brands appeared, designed to be sold at margins that made rivals look greedy or powerless. Retail incentives got sharper. Not just better terms, but terms that only made sense if you played along. And the battlefield moved from smoke to paper. Packaging became a weapon. The color of a packet, the typeface on the label, a name that sounded too close to another name. Both sides started treating trademarks like land deeds. Lawsuits weren't filed to win moral points. They were filed to jam production, scare distributors, and force a brand off shelves while the other side filled the empty space. This is where the public story and the real story split. The public saw cheap cigarettes and loud advertisements. The trade saw men in suits turning screws behind the counter. A shopkeeper doesn't need to be threatened with violence. He only needs to be shown that one supplier can ruin his margins with a phone call. Imperial understood something else too. Britain wasn't only Britain. It had roots. If Duke's machine established itself in London, it could ride the empire's distribution lanes outward, crates to ports, agencies in colonial markets, advertising that traveled with shipping manifests. So Imperial widened the fight beyond home streets. If the Americans wanted Britain, Imperial would make the rest of the map expensive. That's when it stopped being a British market problem and became a world problem. Overseas, the war was even dirtier because the rules were thinner. Whoever controlled the agent controlled the shelf. Whoever controlled the warehouse controlled what arrived first. Whoever controlled the price for one season could starve a rival's cash and force a retreat. And the longer this went on, the more dangerous it became for both sides. Price wars don't just hurt competitors, they burn the attacker too. Every cheap packet is money thrown into a fire on purpose. Every legal fight costs cash. Every contract offer eats margin. It only works if your balance sheet can survive longer than the other man's. By early 1902, the war had reached the point where victory started to look like mutual damage. And that's when the tone changed inside the boardrooms. Not because anyone felt guilty, because someone finally asked the question that ends most corporate wars. How long can we keep paying to keep shooting? By spring 1902, the cigarette war had a rhythm, and it was ugly. In London, you could watch it on a single counter. One week, the clerk offered a familiar British packet without thinking. The next week, he hesitated, because a new deal had arrived with terms he couldn't ignore. Not a discount, a condition. Put this brand in front, or your margins disappear somewhere else. Duke's people treated retail like a switchboard. They didn't need to win every shop. They needed to win the shops that set the tone. The busy corners, the railway kiosks, the wholesalers who fed hundreds of small sellers. If those points flipped, the rest of the street followed. Imperial answered the same way, but with a different kind of pressure. Wills wasn't trying to be clever. He was trying to keep Britain from being taught a lesson in fear. Imperial leaned on its existing supply chain and told retailers, in effect, you can flirt, but you still need us to keep your regular customers happy. And then the war turned even more procedural. Courtrooms became part of the sales strategy. A trademark claim didn't have to win forever. It only had to stall a launch for a month. Packaging complaints became an excuse to drag a rival's brand through hearings while your own product stayed on the counter. Every legal move forced printers, distributors, and shopkeepers to pause, and in this business, a pause is blood loss. On the street level, it got petty and it got real. Posters torn down, brand signs swapped or covered overnight, salesmen poached from the other side and sent back with inside knowledge, wholesalers suddenly out of stock of the brand that had been steady for years. Nothing that looks like a crime in daylight, but enough to make a rival's numbers wobble by Friday. This is where the old money aspect shows up. Not in top hats, in who can afford to burn cash. A price war is a controlled fire. Duke could keep prices low longer because American Tobacco's machine was built to absorb losses in one theater while earning elsewhere. Imperial could keep fighting because the merged firms brought pooled capital and a national distribution base that still printed money in normal weeks. Both sides had deep pockets, and that meant the war didn't end when it should have. It escalated. Then the overseas lanes started heating up. Agents in foreign ports became targets. A contract in one colony could be the difference between winning a region or starving there. If you controlled the warehouse, you controlled what arrived first. If you controlled the advertising space, you controlled what looked legitimate. So the war jumped borders, and the tactics got colder because local loyalties mattered less than volume. But even empires feel pain when the cash keeps bleeding. By mid-1902, the numbers started to scare the men who usually don't scare. Boards asked how long temporary sacrifices would last. Wholesalers complained that margins were being destroyed. Retailers loved the short-term bargains, but hated the instability. And both companies knew the same truth. If you win by dumping prices, you inherit a market trained to expect dumping. That's the point where the smartest people in the room stop thinking about victory. They start thinking about containment. Duke had built his reputation on outlasting rivals, but Imperial was not a small rival. It was a national fusion created for one purpose: to prevent him from doing what he always did. Wills had built a shield, but a shield doesn't generate growth. It only prevents loss. Neither side wanted a permanent stalemate that burned profit and hardened enemies. So quietly, something changed. The attacks kept going in public. The court fights continued. The sales contracts stayed aggressive. But behind closed doors, intermediaries started carrying messages that didn't sound like threats. They sounded like math. And once both sides began doing the same calculation, the cigarette war entered its most dangerous phase. Not the phase where someone fires harder. The phase where someone offers a peace that is really a division of territory. By mid-1902, both empires were winning and losing at the same time. Retailers loved the chaos because cheap packets moved fast. Wholesalers hated it because margins were being crushed. And inside both companies, the same report kept landing on the desk every week. The war was eating profit faster than it was taking territory. Duke's people could keep dumping price in one city and recover elsewhere. Imperial could absorb pain because 13 firms had pooled their capital into one shield. But a shield isn't a growth plan. And a dumping war trains a market to expect dumping forever. So the conversation shifted from how do we crush them to how do we stop paying for this? It didn't start with a summit and a handshake. It started with messages carried through lawyers, bankers, and trusted intermediaries. Quiet questions. What would you accept? What would you never accept? What would make you stop invading home territory? Because that was the real escalation point. Duke wasn't just selling cigarettes in Britain. He was trying to prove a trust could export its playbook. Imperial wasn't just defending London counters. It was trying to stop a precedent that could spread across the empire. Then the idea surfaced that ends a lot of Gilded Age wars. Don't keep fighting for the same street. Redraw the map. The logic was cold. Let American tobacco dominate at home in the United States. Let Imperial dominate at home in Britain. And instead of burning cash overseas, create a joint weapon to take the rest of the world without stepping on each other's throats. That weapon needed a name that sounded neutral, almost boring. Something that didn't scream cartel. Something that sounded like a normal company. British American Tobacco. In 1902, the two enemies agreed to form a shared structure to handle overseas markets, with ownership split between the American and British sides. In practice, it wasn't a peace treaty. It was a division of territory with a corporate seal. Overnight, the rules changed. The same sales tactics didn't disappear. They were redirected. Instead of Duke and Imperial trying to bankrupt each other in the same city, the pressure moved outward, toward foreign markets, where brand loyalty was weaker and the counter could be bought cheaper. Shipping routes mattered more. Agents mattered more. Warehouses mattered more. The war didn't end. It moved. And if you were a retailer in London or New York, you felt the difference immediately. The insane price drops eased. The fighting brands stopped showing up like grenades. Lawsuits didn't vanish. But the tone shifted because the mission had shifted. Now the mission was global order. A packet wasn't just tobacco and paper anymore. It was a flag. A way to mark a market as American-controlled, British-controlled, or reserved for the joint machine. That's why this story isn't just American tobacco versus Imperial. This is the moment the cigarette industry starts acting like an international border system, drawn by men in suits who never had to stand behind a counter. But there was one problem baked into the deal. The war had proven how powerful a trust could be, how easily it could coerce distribution, how quickly it could erase competitors without touching a factory floor. And back in the United States, People were already learning to hate that kind of power. So while the world was being divided on paper, another force was getting ready to do what rivals couldn't. Not dump prices, not buy retailers, not file trademark suits. Just cut the machine apart by law. The 1902 peace didn't feel like peace on the street. It felt like the temperature suddenly dropping. Counters stopped flipping every week. Prices stopped collapsing like a trapdoor. The lawsuits didn't vanish, but they stopped being used like daily weapons. The war hadn't ended because anyone felt mercy. It ended because both sides realized the same ugly truth. If you keep burning your own margins, you don't inherit a market. You inherit a habit of chaos. So the industry did what old money does when the fight gets too public and too expensive. It turned the war into structure. British American tobacco wasn't created to be friendly. It was created to make sure the next fight happened far away from home territory. Overseas markets became the new arena. Shipping lanes, agents, warehouses, customs stamps, and advertising walls in ports most customers would never visit. The cigarette stopped being just a product. It became a flag you could plant. And for a few years, it worked. A global tobacco order began to harden. The two empires learned where to stop pushing and where to push harder. The violence stayed mostly invisible, hidden inside contracts and distribution control. If you were a customer, you saw packets. If you were a retailer, you saw terms. If you were a small competitor, you saw the door close. But back in the United States, a different war was catching up to Duke's machine. The trust era had created a public mood that was turning sharp. People were tired of systems that could decide who lived and who vanished without ever firing a shot. And American tobacco had all the fingerprints: consolidation, channel control, pricing pressure, brand absorption, the same central office logic that Standard Oil had used in oil. In 1911, the Supreme Court finally moved. American tobacco was ordered dismantled for monopolization and anti-competitive conduct. The trust wasn't told to behave better. It was told to split. The machine lost its one brain. That's the twist that makes the cigarette war feel bigger in hindsight. The 1902 peace created a global structure designed to end conflict between giants. Then, less than a decade later, American law hit one of those giants in the place rivals couldn't: the legal right to exist as a single organism. If you imagine what that looks like inside a company, it isn't dramatic. It's quiet. A boardroom where the map stays on the wall, but the pins get reassigned. Lawyers turning one set of ownership lines into many. Sales managers rewriting territories that used to be controlled from one office. The same factories still rolling paper and tobacco, but the command chain fractured. Duke didn't lose tobacco. He lost unity. And once unity breaks, everything changes. Price discipline becomes harder. Distribution pressure becomes less coordinated. Competitors find air pockets. The market doesn't become fair. It becomes contested again, because the switches are no longer all in one hand. That's why this story lands the way it does. It's not just a corporate fight. It's the moment cigarettes become a global power game, and the moment that power game proves it can still be cut apart when a country decides the machine has gone too far. The last image I keep is simple: a shipping crate stamped for an overseas market, a row of packets printed with new company names, a clerk behind a counter still selling the same habit, and somewhere in the background, the sound of the war fading into paperwork, because the world has already been divided, and the only question left is who gets to hold the pen. Like the video, subscribe, and comment. Where are you watching from? This is the corner of YouTube where old money wars get told like they actually happened. If you watch the video to the end, did Duke play the smartest war of the era?